Welcome to episode 29 of The Pulpiteer. I'm your host, Eric Hepburn, and I'm glad to have you join us for today's episode. Today's podcast is entitled Remapping Relationship. This week is a live recording and it is inspired and named for Chapter 4 of our congregational read this year, Prentis Hemphill's book, What It Takes to Heal, How Transforming Ourselves Can Change the World. If you, as a podcast listener, would like to read along, we'd love the company. Our plan is to do a chapter a month, usually on the third Sunday of each month, with the podcast coming out the following week. For those of you who don't yet know Prentis Hemphill, they are unearthing the connections between healing, community accountability, and our most inspired visions for social transformation. Prentis is a therapist, somatics teacher, and facilitator, political organizer, writer, and the founder of the Embodiment Institute. They self-identify in the book as a queer, black, non-binary woman. We'll begin with a reading from the book, delivered by Mark Vai.
I invite you into a place of deeper stillness and reflection with these excerpts from Prentis Hemphill. The path forward, or the work to do, is always how we can be in relationship with one another. And I do think that takes boundaries. Boundaries give us the space to do the work of loving ourselves. They might be actually the first and fundamental expression of self-love. Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously.
Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. Back a few months ago when we did a question box and I asked you to give me some things to talk about, one of the most challenging questions in that box was, how do I deal with toxic people in my life, toxic people in my family? And I think these quotes about boundaries start to set the stage for an answer to a challenging question like that. You see, because of the way family hierarchies tend to work in our culture, we have shown up to those whom we love and who love us, but whom nonetheless might be unhealthy and abusive, and we have felt called to stay in that out of a sense of obligation, out of a sense of deference to age and authority, or the way that relationship is supposed to be, despite how it actually is. So this idea that the boundary is the distance at which I can love that person and continue to love myself might be a hint at how we start to find some balance in that. Prentis tells a story in the book of meeting with her estranged father after 10 years. She says, he got too comfortable and he started laying into my mom again. And I felt in my body that the heart that had been opening and softening toward him in our earlier conversation began to close and harden. And that was my body telling me that I had reached the place where I needed to set a boundary. That to stay there and listen to this refreshed vitriol that was carried about a past relationship was poisonous to her. And that it was time for her to say, thanks, Dad, it's been a great lunch. I've got to be somewhere. And you get up and you leave. You see, it's a way of creating space and distance. And we can imagine a couple of different ways that she might have responded to this moment. We can imagine her reacting angrily to her father. You know, Dad, I don't want to hear this about Mom. I'm going to now make you wrong and let you know that I think that what you're doing is wrong. And we're going to start the cycle of fighting all over again. The cycle of fighting that led to them being estranged for 10 years. We're going to start that all over again. But you see, she had learned something in those intervening 10 years through her work with somatics, which is, I don't have to make you wrong. I just have to claim the space I need for me to stay in right relationship with me. So I don't think this is the only way, but I think it's one tool that we can start to develop when there are people and influences in our life that drain our energy, that drag us into a negative reactive space, when there are people in our life who are toxic. My father and I were estranged for 20 years. And when my mother was dying of cancer, they had been divorced for a long time. But when my mother was dying from cancer, I got a call from my father out of the blue. And this was how the call went. I just wanted to call and tell you that I'm sorry. And he listed a few things that he was genuinely sorry for. And then he said, I just wanted you to know that. And he hung up. And that was the beginning of the repair of our relationship. You see, because I was in my early 40s and I had never heard those words from his mouth before. Maybe you have some people in your life who don't seem to know those two words, who have never been sorry for much, or certainly not expressed it to you. And sometimes when that happens, we build up a backlog of apologies that we're anxiously waiting for. So you see, apology is a way of healing something that's broken. Maybe we'll have a sermon on that in the spring. It's worth its own sermon, the art of a good apology. You see, people do change every day. Sometimes we get better. Sometimes we get worse. Sometimes it's a bit hard to tell which way we're headed. But repairs are possible. And sometimes they're still not enough. Sometimes the relationship can only get so deep because of where two people are. So maybe it's not a relationship where you talk on the phone every 2 or 3 days. Maybe it's once a month. Maybe it's once a quarter. Maybe it's we talk on Thanksgiving and Christmas and birthdays, and that's enough. I'm not here to tell you what the right distance is for the toxic person who you love the most. And you see, here's the crux of it. The ones we love the most who are also toxic, that's what hurts the most, isn't it? I think I got a tab in here about this. Charles Feltman, author of The Thin Book of Trust, describes trust this way: as choosing to make something you value vulnerable to another person's actions. Trust is a risk we take with one another to do something bigger than we could have done alone. So being in relationship is like that. It's choosing to put our own emotional well-being partly in the control to make it vulnerable to another human being. But there is a sense in which trust is also earned. We can tell how well they will care for our tender, gentle heart by how they handle it when it is in their care. And maybe the definition of a toxic person is, I can't trust them to hold my heart at all. Or maybe it is, well, if we only get together briefly and every so often, I can be open to them for a little while before it starts to give you that feeling. That, oh boy, I got to get out of here. Boy, I wish I was anywhere else but here. Feeling. Here's the thing. Many of you, like me, were probably raised to think that our feelings about these things were less important than what society expected about the nature of the relationship. This is especially true of parents and children. What does it mean to honor thy mother and father? What does that look like? What does it look like when the person who is supposed to hold your heart the safest doesn't have the skills they need to do that? How can you still honor them when they are not trustworthy with your most valued and precious self? For some of them, probably most of them, just a little bit at a time. But in prioritizing social expectations over our own feelings, we learn to mistrust ourselves, to set those healthy boundaries where they need to be, to reclaim some space. Prentis tells another story at the very beginning of the chapter of this book. As for those of you who don't know, today is a congregational read Sunday, and we're reading What It Takes to Heal by Prentis Hemphill, and we're on chapter 4. So if you're new and visiting, and you think you might want to come visit us again, in January we'll be reading chapter 5, so you can catch up. But she's talking about her experience as a young black girl walking through the mall and getting ping-ponged off people, like having to constantly dodge to avoid the adults, and the counsel that she got from an older friend who said, just pick a line on the floor and stick to it. They will notice you and move out of your way. And it was a first act for her of reclaiming some space and some agency in a world where she felt she was at everyone else's mercy. So if that's a metaphor for how we show up in our lives, what does it mean to find our line on the floor and walk it? What does that look like? I think one of the things that it looks like is getting clear within yourself about what your values and priorities are. That's your line. And you may get bumped into if you walk that line. You almost certainly will. But you will also find people who will walk in companionship with you on that line. And you will find people who will move out of your way and respect and understand why you have chosen that line to walk. Those who respect the line that you walk, we might call companions on our journey. One of the things that my wife and I still struggle to practice is when we meet new people and are trying to develop friendship networks, when we leave that interaction, do we feel more alive than when we started? Or do we feel depleted? We all know this experience, right? Sometimes there are some people you spend time with and you leave the interaction and you think, oh, that was just exhausting. I feel worse about myself. I feel worse about the world. I feel just worse than I did when we started. But sometimes we don't trust that our own sensibility about people's either toxicity or compatibility is worthy enough to be honored. There's a story from the book that we're reading with the board of trustees. It's a book called Dare to Lead by Brene Brown. And she tells the following story. She says, my husband and I had just gotten married, and it was my first birthday with him as a married couple. And my family, her family, I'm speaking as Brene, my family had a tradition of making a big deal out of birthdays. So you'd wake up in the morning and there'd be signs and decorations in the house and presents hidden, and it was a big deal, and we made a big deal out of it. And I got up this morning just expectant. And nothing. And I was so mad. And so, the next day I was with my therapist, and I told her, I said, well, this is how we did it, and he didn't do anything, and I don't think he cares, and I don't think he loves me. And the therapist said, well, wait a minute. Did you tell him about your family tradition? Well, if I have to tell him, it's just not worth it. Now, a good therapist is worth a lot. The therapist looked at her and said, maybe if you didn't tell him, it's because you don't think you're worth it. Oh, flip the scales, right? If we don't care enough about ourselves to articulate our needs and wants to those in our life who might be able to grant them, it might not be the disservice from them that we think it is. So, as we're talking about labeling other people toxic, I think we also have to show up to that asking the hard question, what is my part? Am I part of what I perceive as toxic? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes it's no. But usually it's not at either ends of that spectrum. Usually it's somewhere in the middle. Usually we have a part in it. And what we can do, what we are called to do, is take ownership for our part in it. Dad, I'm happy to meet with you. And I'm looking forward to being in relationship again. But we can't talk about your relationship with Mom from back in my childhood. I want to take that off the table. I don't think that's a productive space for us to be in. Is that okay with you? Can you agree to that? Now, because Dad might not know, Dad might think, oh, you were there too, and you thought it was as awful as I think it is. And so now we can bond over this. How would he know otherwise? You have to think enough of yourself to say, this is what I need this to look like. This is what I'm up for in this adventure, and this is what I'm not up for yet, maybe ever. Unvoiced expectations are not the other person's problem. They're our problem. And it's harder than it sounds, isn't it? I can see brains out there working. That's a good thing. It might require you to spend some time getting clear about what it is you do and don't want. It might require you to spend some time unpacking the way things have always been in your family and asking whether that's a tradition that you want to continue in your life or your own family. It is the way that things were done with you. Is it the way that you want things to continue to be after you? Is it a lesson? Is it a way of being in the world worthy of being passed on to the next generation? Chances are that if it hurt you, it probably isn't a tradition worth saving. There's another name for that. We call it the transmission of intergenerational trauma. So that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is the following truism. Everybody's doing the best they can with what they have. It's a statement that invites you to generate deep compassion for everyone, including yourself. But it can also be misused. It can also be used as an excuse to not do your work, to accept the status quo as forever and always and inevitable. You recreate the status quo in your own life every day through your own choices. That is the simple yet profound truth of human life and of life as we know it. You recreate the status quo every day in your own life through how you show up. That is your part. So in a culture like ours, you have to work to be anti-patriarchal or anti-misogynist or anti-racist or anti-status, class, caste, all of it. All of that stuff is in the cultural waters that we swim in. And if you just do what everybody else has been doing, you perpetuate that stuff. To swim against the stream takes work. And over again, I feel like it's my job up here in the pulpit to invite you to that work. But it tends to feel awful serious sometimes, doesn't it? That work. Overwhelming, out of reach, depressing. Here's one of the things. I'm going to transition right now. Right now, I'm going to start making the swing toward the holidays. Are you ready? If you don't find the joy in the work, you're doing it wrong. If you're thinking about this as a burden that you have to figure out how to carry, in addition to all the other burdens, it's going to stay stuck just like it is. It's not an extra backpack you have to put on to climb up the already hard mountain you're on. It is the realization that 7 of the 18 backpacks you're carrying are BS. And you can stop, take them off, put them on the trail, and leave them behind. And as a matter of fact, that trail that you thought you had to take up the hardest part of the mountain to prove your worth isn't the only trail. Ends up right over here, there's a trail. Might be a little bit longer walk, but there are birds chirping. It goes through an alpine meadow where there are sunshines and flowers, and you can see the dripping of the glacier coming down the mountain. There's all kinds of beauty for you to see and all kinds of joy for you to experience on this journey. Well, I'm not asking you to pick up a new burden. I'm asking you to look at the burdens you're still carrying and ask which ones you can leave behind. I'm going to leave behind the story that I'm not worthy enough to walk my own line through Dillard's. I'm going to leave behind the story that it's all on me to make things right with that person in my family who I experience as toxic. I'm going to leave behind the story that if I don't have so-and-so's approval, I can't ever be happy. I'm just going to leave it behind. I don't need that story anymore. It's not true now. It wasn't true when I learned it. It ain't going to get true later. What can you lay down today? What baggage can you abandon as we head into this holiday season? What thing are you carrying on your heart that was absolutely going to come up at a holiday party and make your experience of that holiday party 10 times worse than it has to be? Because you had to carry that old bag into the party and you had to open it up and unpack it among a group of your friends and let them know, do you see this rock? Do you know how heavy it is? I have been carrying this rock for 19 years, and it just keeps getting heavier. Unbelievable. And underneath it, I got this big bag of sand. Oh, it's so heavy. You would not believe it. And I had to walk up the most difficult part of the mountain. Did you know that? We're at crossroads all the time where we get to choose how to show up and what to bring with us. All the time, every day. What are you carrying? Are you carrying the stuff that you need? Or are you carrying the stuff that somebody else told you you had to carry? Have you stopped to wonder if maybe they were wrong? That you have to carry that thing. It's a strange paradox, but I think that self-worth, when truly actualized, lets you know that you can go on the hike without a lot of baggage because you'll still be there. And you are reliable and beautiful and valuable and trustworthy and all you ever really needed and all you ever really have. That and the relationships you build with others. You can't take anything else with you. But I have a deep suspicion that those things persist in ways we have yet to understand. Let's see if one of these other bookmarks is calling to me. Our relationships can be full of everything life is. Our relationships can be powerful places of transformation. It only takes moving out from underneath what is expected and into what is real. Until next time, thank you for joining us on The Pulpiteer. If you'd enjoyed the podcast, you can help others find it by liking and subscribing. If you're so moved, you can even leave us a review. All reviews will be gratefully received. If you'd like to support the podcast directly, you can make a donation at sangabrieluu.org/give. The Pulpiteer Podcast is a production of the San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Georgetown, Texas. The podcast is hosted by Spotify, and theme music is by John Faber. Our live recording tech crew is Frank Sanders, Rob Berthold, Keith Hutchinson, and Andrea McDaniel. The podcast is produced and performed by Eric Hepburn.